Again, good morning to everyone. My name is Jason Riley. I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, and I'd like to welcome everyone to our symposium today, which is titled Prospects for Black America, the Moynihan Report Turns 50. So if you're looking for the Prospects for White America symposium, you are in the wrong room. That would be any of the other rooms in the building. I'll be very brief with my remarks because we've got some excellent panels lined up, and I want to give them as much time as possible for discussion. I'll get a chance to speak a little later on this afternoon, so I hope you can stick around. I began working at the Manhattan Institute in February of this year, but the idea for this conference, a conference on race, first occurred to me many years ago when I was still on staff with the Wall Street Journal. I came across a book called the Fairmont Papers, which essentially is a transcription of a conference that occurred in 1980 at the Fairmont Hotel in San Francisco. The conference was organized and hosted by the economist Thomas Sowell, and it was titled Black Alternatives. Sowell gave the opening remarks where he noted that the economic and social advancement of blacks in this country is still a great unfinished task. He said methods and approaches currently being used to advance blacks demand re-examination. He said there's growing factual evidence of counterproductive results from noble intentions, and that the goal of the conference was to explore alternative approaches. That's why we're here, he explained, to explore alternatives, not to create a new orthodoxy with its own messiahs and its own excommunications of those who dare to think for themselves. He said the people who were invited to speak here are people seeking alternatives, people who have challenged conventional wisdom on one or more issues, people who think for themselves. Some are Democrats, some are Republicans, some are liberals, some are conservatives, but all are open to fundamentally reassessing what's been tried in terms of public policy aimed at helping the black underclass. And finally, he noted that America has been through an historic phase of struggle for basic civil rights for blacks, a struggle that was necessary but not sufficient. He said the very success of that struggle created new priorities and new urgencies, economic realities to confront, and self-development to achieve in the schools, at work, in our communities. He said all that back in 1980. And I must have come across it in the late 1990s. And now here we are in 2015. And I don't think those sentiments are any less relevant today. A few years after I discovered the Fairmont Papers, I became friends with Sowell, who'll be 85 this year and has yet another book out in a couple months. I just got the galleys in the mail last week. I asked him about that conference. I've asked him about it several times over the years. And he said it went very well, got a lot of press coverage, a lot of good feedback. He said he had every intention of hosting a second one, but the plan simply fell through, and he never got around to it. I said, that's the kind of conference we need, and if someone else is hosting it, Tom, I've never been invited. After I joined the Manhattan Institute, I'd figured I'd give it a shot, and so here we are. And I hope we can proceed in the spirit that Sowell described, honestly evaluating what's been tried and opening our minds to alternative approaches. We know the conventional explanations for the black-white gaps we see today in education, incarceration, employment, incomes, etc. The conventional wisdom is that it's mainly about residual racism, the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, etc. The conventional wisdom is to call for more government resources, more government programs, more wealth redistribution, and so forth. But the people asked to participate in today's symposium all bring something new to these discussions. They're not afraid to think outside the box about addressing these problems. They're open to new approaches, And just as important, they're willing to honestly evaluate what's been tried already, what's working and what's not working. And quite a lot isn't working. This year, we're marking the 50th anniversary of Daniel Patrick Moynihan's report on the Black family. It was a controversial document when he issued it while serving as Assistant Secretary of Labor under President Johnson. And it remains controversial today. Moynihan highlighted troubling cultural trends among inner-city blacks, with a special focus on the increasing number of fatherless homes. The fundamental problem is that of family structure, he wrote. The evidence, not final, but powerfully persuasive, is that the Negro family in the urban ghettos is crumbling. For his troubles, Moynihan was denounced as a victim-blaming racist bent on undermining the civil rights movement. Even worse, his findings were ignored by public policymakers, including the Great Society architects, who would go on to expand old programs and formulate new ones that exacerbated the problems that Moynihan had identified. Marriage was penalized. Single parenting was subsidized. History has proved that Moynihan was onto something. When the report was released, about 25% of black children and 5% of white children lived in households headed by a single mother. During the next 20 years, the black percentage would double and the racial gap would widen. Today, more than 70% of all black births are to unmarried women, twice the white percentage. For decades, research has shown that the likelihood of teen pregnancy, drug abuse, dropping out of school, and many other social problems grew dramatically when fathers were absent. One of the most comprehensive studies ever done on juvenile delinquency concluded that the most critical factor affecting the prospect that a male youth will encounter the criminal justice system is the presence of a father in the home. Unfortunately, the Moynihan report, the Moynihan report was an attempt to have an honest conversation about family breakdown and black pathology, one that many today still refuse to join. Faulting ghetto culture for ghetto outcomes remains largely taboo. An op-ed in the New York Times just a few days ago about the Baltimore rioting and high black crime rates carried the headline, "Black culture is not the problem." What is the problem? According to this author, the problem is white racism. Quote, "The problem originates in a political culture that has long bound black bodies to questions of property. Yes, I'm referring to slavery," unquote. I'm hoping the discussions today will be a little less reductive than that and a little more honest. Black crime rates in 1960 were lower than they are today. If the legacy of slavery explains the level of black crime today, that legacy must have skipped a couple generations and then reasserted itself. Moynihan said that his goal was to better define a problem that many thought, mistakenly in his view, was no big deal and would solve itself in the wake of civil rights gains. His skepticism was warranted. Before we get started with the panels, I just want to thank a few people. Larry Mohn, who heads the Manhattan Institute, signed off on this event. Dean Ball, Lee Harrington, Taisha Camacho, and Debbie Ezzard handled everything from contacting the panelists to securing a venue. I want to thank them all for their hard work. I'd like to invite the first panelists up, and while they're doing so and getting mic'd, I can read their bios. Let's see. The Honorable Robert Ehrlich is a former governor of the state of Maryland. He was the first Republican governor in 36 years when he was elected back in 2002. He's also served as a U.S. congressman and a state legislator. He made record investments in public schools as the governor of Maryland, which I think is important for our discussion today. He authored Maryland's first public charter school law, which enabled more than 7,000 students to attend 30 new public charter schools. And he doubled funding for need-based college scholarships, helping college enrollment reach an all-time high on his watch. Heather McDonald is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor to City Journal, where her work has canvassed a range of topics, including homeland security, immigration, policing, homelessness, and education policy. Her books include Are Cops Racist?, a City Journal Analogy, which investigates the workings of the police department and the controversy of racial profiling. She's a non-practicing lawyer and is clerked for the Honorable Stephen Reinhart, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. She's also the recipient of the 2005 Bradley Prize for Outstanding Intellectual Achievement. John McWhorter is a contributing editor at City Journal who comments extensively on race, ethnicity, and cultural issues. He also blurbed my last book. He's the author of All About the Beat, Why Hip Hop Can't Save Black America. He's the author of Losing the Race, as well as a follow-up book called Winning the Race, Beyond the Crisis in Black America. John's also a linguist and teaches in the English and Comparative Literature Department at Columbia University. The panel will be moderated by Judge William Kuntz, serves on the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York. Judge Kuntz was previously a commercial litigator in private practice in New York, and since 1987, he has served as a commissioner of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board, supervising hundreds of investigations into allegations of abuse by members of the New York City Police Department. The title of the first panel is Reducing Crime Rates in the Black Community. And I'll let Judge Kuntz take it from here. Thank you.
Before we begin, I would like you to join me in a moment of silence and respect for the New York City police officer, Brian Moore, who died yesterday. He was 25 years old, and he was patrolling in my parents' old neighborhood of Queens Village, New York. Thank you. We have a curious tradition in public forums such as this, one in which people who have established themselves as experts, people who are well known to you, people who are well spoken, and people who need no introduction, receive an introduction from someone who is obscure to you, not known at all, and you're wondering, what the hell is he doing up there? That would be me. My name is Bill Kuntz. I was born in Bed-Stuy, raised in Harlem. My father and mother, who've passed on now, raised me and my younger brother. Lived in Queens Village as a teenager. And I wanted to tell you how important this panel is, both personally and professionally. Today, we are going to consider the facts, and I've had a preliminary discussion with our panelists, that as the murder of police officer Moore demonstrated yesterday, there is no such thing as a routine police-civilian encounter. Not for the police officer, not for the citizen. For 23 years, I served on the Civilian Complaint Review Board reviewing allegations of police misconduct in New York City. And each and every one of those complaints, whether meritorious or not, was unique. Each and every one of those encounters had the potential for deadly force or for some of the most exhilarating and uplifting encounters between our citizens and our law enforcement officials. Each had the potential for heroism or disaster. I would hope when you leave this panel discussion today, you exorcise from your vocabulary the phrase routine police encounter. There is no such thing. Mindful of that tradition, I will now turn this over to our truly distinguished panel, our knowledgeable experts, and we will begin with the former governor of Maryland.
So a week ago, Sunday, I was driving my 11-year-old and my 15-year-old back from a bull roast in Perry Hall, Maryland. And we were driving down the Jones Falls Expressway. Any Baltimoreans, Marylanders here? Raise your hand. I know you. And I figured, you know what, we'll just cut up North Avenue, go back to Annapolis and cut over to Hilton Street. Area is very familiar to me, street's very familiar to me, and I did. And we pulled up to a light, and there was a little African-American girl, and she was waving to us. I think the parents recognized me and my kids, and we drove our way home to Annapolis, Maryland, all nice and happy. And less than 18 hours later, that intersection that I drove past was the center of the universe with regard to race and riots and police and more bad press for a city I grew up in, right outside Baltimore City. So when you talk about personal, someone who grew up in Arbutus, Maryland, whose dad worked very close to that intersection, a college compin that I had championed as governor, a CVS I knew very well, friends in that neighborhood. It's very personal, very personal. So as a result, obviously, over the past few days, all of the TV folks have been calling and getting me on their shows and asking me why, what, where, what do you think? And I have to say that my initial thoughts were probably the same thoughts everyone in this room had. The first thought was, on the first day, when those kids, some of whom from Douglas High School, some from other high schools, gathered together and began to do their thing, your first thought was, where are the fathers? More fathers, less rioters. Knowing the academic achievements or lack thereof of some of these area schools and past battles I fought, particularly as governor, against unions and others who protect monopolies, negligent monopolies. My second thought was more degrees, less rioters. As someone who had authored in National Review Online in October, 50 years since Moynihan, and I recommend it to all of you, my thought was more sentencing statutes that make sense, less rioters. More drug laws that make sense, less rioters. And so, after these initial thoughts, during this interview process, as the days unfolded, I also began to think about the facts of this case and what was truly at issue here. Because these were consequences of failed policies for decades. But what were the facts of this case? How did a severed spine result from this particular transport? Who was negligent? Who was not? Who should be held responsible? And the real issue here, which is police practices. Much less race, although it's race, because race equals ratings. But police practices and what happened with regard to this particular prisoner in that van that night. And we don't know. We don't know. But we'll find out. We'll certainly find out. My concluding comment is this. As someone who has been in state legislature, Congress, and governor, I certainly would indulge to some extent the idea of healing. Who's against healing? We have to heal. But if it's healing on familiar terms, if it's the same old MO, if it's the same old paradigm as you heard out of the president's mouth the other day and others, we need more money. $22 trillion since the Great Society. If that's the premise, I'm not going to play. Those folks in those neighborhoods shouldn't play. Policymakers shouldn't play. And we should not indulge it. Because if it's just that, nobody should be surprised if we see a repeat in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 3 years, 10 years. And as someone who's driven through those neighborhoods my entire life, I wouldn't be surprised to see the same conditions if it's the same paradigm. So maybe, hopefully, just you pray that something good can come of this. Nothing good has come from this yet. But maybe this conference, this conversation, these values can actually become a part of the agenda, not just in Annapolis, but in Washington, D.C. And if that's the case, something good will have come of this.
Thank you. We will have opening statements from John and then from Heather. And then we're going to have a discussion amongst the panelists, and then we will have questions from our learned audience as well. Sir.
Judge Kuntz, if I have value to this event, it's as a responder. I'm much better at hearing a text and saying something. I think that Heather McDonald should go second.
Therefore, I will take that as a friendly amendment. Although, as Judge Mukasey can tell you, I wouldn't let him get away with this in my courtroom. Oh, so you didn't do your homework, counsel, I see. Are you billing your client for this? Heather, you will defer to the gentlelady to your left. Go ahead.
Right, I'd also translate John's remark as I want the last word, but we'll let that pass. I'll have the postscript. For the last 9 months, our nation has been convulsed by a movement known as Black Lives Matter. That movement was triggered by the fatal police shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri last summer, and it triggered riots, die-ins, a movement to eliminate traditional grand jury proceedings when a police officer uses lethal force, and a presidential task force on policing. The premise of that Black Lives Matter movement boils down to essentially that the police are the biggest threat facing young black men today. I want to propose a counter-hypothesis to that conceit, which is that, in fact, there is no government agency more dedicated to the proposition that Black Lives Matter than the police. Now, every unjustified police shooting or death by other means is an unmitigated tragedy, and the police have to work incessantly to refine their tactics to make sure that they don't misperceive threat. And the police also have an indefeasible obligation to treat everybody they encounter with courtesy and respect, and that obligation is too often violated. The police develop very rough attitudes on the street, in part because of the behavior that they receive in trying to make arrests or investigate crimes. But that civilian behavior is no excuse for treating people rudely and peremptorily. Nevertheless, in New York City alone today, 10,000 minority males are alive who would have been dead had homicide rates remained at their early 1990s levels. And what saved those lives was a revolution in policing that began in 1994 and that has continued and spread throughout the country. And the essential aspects of that revolution is an obsession with crime data, analyzing crime data on a daily, if not hourly basis to try and figure out where crime patterns are emerging, and accountability for police precinct commanders. It used to be that nobody assumed that the police could control crime or held them accountable for it. And now the NYPD is ruthless about imposing responsibility on precinct commanders. If they do not save black lives, their careers are at jeopardy. What happened in New York, thanks to this revolution in policing, was to liberate the law-abiding residents of inner city neighborhoods to be able to go out into the public to shop, to go to the store, pick up their mail in post office. Elderly women could come down into the lobbies of their buildings without being fearful of drug dealers. And there's one other thing that drives New York policing now, and that's community demands for assistance. Right now, we're seeing a movement to depolice, decriminalize. In New York, there's an effort to cut back on broken windows policing, which is the idea of enforcing low-level quality of life offenses. This said to unfairly burden minority communities. If this push to decriminalize becomes effective, it's going to involve ignoring the very people whom the advocates purport to represent. Policing low-level offenses is a moral imperative. I have never gone to a police community meeting in Harlem or the South Bronx or Central Brooklyn when I haven't heard variants of the following requests. You arrest drug dealers and they're back on the corner the next day. Why can't you get them off the streets? There's kids hanging out in my lobby smoking weed. Why can't you arrest them for loitering? I smell weed in the hallway. Somebody's breaking the law here. I met an elderly cancer amputee in the Mount Hope section of the Bronx who was terrified to go into her lobby and get her mail because of the youth hanging out there. She said, "Please, Jesus, send more police." The only time she felt safe was when the police were there. So I'll conclude, while we need constantly to work on police-community relations, what is being lost, I think, in this discussion is that to date, short of, I would agree with the judge, rebuilding the black family, the second best solution to giving the same rights of public safety and freedom to inner city neighborhoods that the wealthy enjoy is sound and effective proactive policing. Thank you.
Thank you. John, as the last responder, would you like to respond?
I would.
Okay.
This is how I see the issue that this panel is devoted to. It is definitely true that it would be ideal if we could do what we're calling rebuilding the black family. Obviously, that's true. There are various things that go on that I don't think need to be spelled out again here, that ideally would not be going on. But the problem is, what is the likelihood that those changes are going to happen, whether or not we say that they're going to? And after 50 years, I think it's quite clear that there's no way to create a movement in black America that would rebuild the kind of black family we're talking about. I'm not saying that it shouldn't happen. It clearly can't be done. So for example, we have to really talk about what we mean here. Could it be that a certain number of black leaders and columnists started making a certain call for the rebuilding of the black family and it would be effective? Let's face it, if, say, 1 out of 2 of those black leaders and columnists made that call, then they would be raked over the coals by the usual suspects. And so Ta-Nehisi Coates at The Atlantic and Jamel Bowie at Slate and all of the other people would talk about what horrible human beings these leaders and columnists and academics were for not understanding the role of institutional racism in the past. Now, would those people end up crying or need to go into therapy? No. But the point is, what would result is convocations and op-eds where people battled it out over whether we were talking about culture or the system, and the result would be a draw. Nobody would learn anything, and nothing would change. So that's what would happen if 1 out of 2 people decided to devote themselves to rebuilding the black family. If Al Sharpton decided to take that line, Michael Eric Dyson would write a 10,000-word piece in the New Republic about what a terrible person Al Sharpton was, and the result would be a draw. So let's imagine.
But Cornel West would no longer write the foreword to
Well, there you go. And things would move on. Let's say that somehow all black leaders, or even 95% black academics and black columnists, decided that the black family needed to be rebuilt, and they said it. Well, let's face it, there is too much diversity of opinion in the black community for that to be a possibility. Would it be nice? Yes. But could it happen? No. There's too much diversity now. Even under Jim Crow, there was more diversity in black opinion than we tend to remember, and I don't just mean Du Bois and Washington. In 1955, there was massive diversity in the black community such that it was hard to say what the black voice was. Certainly now, there never will be that consensus. It'd be nice if there would be, but it can't be. So, my being a linguist, I know in this setting seems like some sort of abstraction. That's this other thing that I do. Most people have no way of knowing what linguistics is. And I used to say that my race work and my linguistics work were completely separate. But that's less true as I get older. Linguistics is a problem-solving discipline. It's not about policing people's grammar. It's not about speaking other languages. It's actually half humanities and half science. It's taught in the same way as engineering and biology. One must work things out. And increasingly, I'm realizing that my take on race issues in America is based on the idea of how can we solve the problem. And solving the problem is not always through the way that might seem most intuitive. And when I see something like Baltimore, when I see something like Ferguson, and when you see these things repeating themselves, it seems to me that what you're looking for is one solution, one card that you could pull that could make the whole house fall down. And I don't think that it's a call for change in the black family. That doesn't seem to work. But could something else work? And I think it would. So for example, Heather, you're mentioning the people in the projects who want to get these people off of the streets who are peddling drugs. That is very real, that is very true. I wish more of America would understand that black communities themselves want more policing. But in terms of this endless cycle that we go through, I find myself thinking, here's this person who is keeping the wolf from the door by selling drugs. Now, why is he doing that? Well, because drugs can be sold for a markup. So you're not going to get rich, but you can keep the wolf from the door. And if you've had a terrible education and not much of a life, and you drop out of school after 11th grade, well, what are you going to do? Well, in 1935, you could get a job in a factory. Well, you're not going to do that now, and yet people still drop out of school 10th or 11th grade. What are you going to do? When those people get killed selling drugs, the newspaper will say they worked odd jobs. That's a euphemism for if you dropped out of school after 10th or 11th grade because it wasn't doing anything for you, well, you might go into this drug trade, which is there because drugs are illegal and therefore can be sold for a markup. And so you look at this entire situation, and I find myself thinking, not as some sort of libertine about drug use, but as somebody who thinks, wouldn't it be nice if cops and kids like Freddie Gray didn't encounter one another so often? How can you get those people away from each other? Suppose there was no such thing as being picked up by a cop because of your possession of or your sale of this and that. Because if you couldn't keep the wolf from the door by selling these things, then what would happen, I have all reason to predict, is that fewer people would drop out of school, and even a person who was dealing with being underserved and being given a bad hand would have no choice but to get a job. If I were somebody living in an inner city community and I had been underserved by my school and my father hadn't been around, I can very much imagine that I might want to do a job that would involve not leaving my neighborhood, not learning a new way to talk, spending time with my friends, with a looming possibility of getting really rich. I'd choose that. However, if that possibility didn't exist, then I would go get low-level work and hopefully build. In other words, it would go back to the way even poor black communities were before. And so, black people and crime. My thought is that the linchpin of black people and crime is the drug issue. Jack Riley is the head of the DEA in Chicago. He says that 90% of black violent crimes are about drugs and gang wars and turf. So there's often a conversation we have about black people and violence, as if the violence is, I don't know where this violence is supposed to come from, but the fact that there is drugs is one thing, but a lot of violent crime is not just because people like to fight, it's because people are in gangs. What's a gang for? It's not West Side Story. The gang is not so people can hang out together and snap their fingers and do little dances. The gang is for selling drugs, that's what it's for. If drugs weren't illegal, then there wouldn't be a gang to be in. And next thing you know, there would be less violence. People wouldn't have guns. Black people have no love of guns innately. The guns are there because of patrolling the turf. So it seems to me that what we're really talking about is getting rid of the war on drugs, not because that's an issue that's natively important to me, but because I think that that would keep the cops and these men away from each other, and it would give an incentive for these men to seek legal work and to not be in danger of being imprisoned or killed. Now, it's easy to think, in conclusion,
Yes.
that it's asking too much of these men. And I would say that to think that these men would not get jobs if there were nothing to do but get those jobs is like being someone in 1996 saying that with welfare reformed, black women are going to be shivering on subway grates. That didn't happen then, and it wouldn't happen to black men now. I think we just need to try it. Thank you.
Well, as we know, the repeal of prohibition resulted in the end of organized crime and the mafia in New York City. Governor, what's your view of legalizing narcotics to keep the wolf from the door?
You know, where I was born, the cops would come around and shake down the numbers runners. I grew up in an apartment complex in the 50s, 60s outside Baltimore. And then in the 70s, one day I awakened and the state was the numbers runner. You got to play to win, right? And you got to play the pick three. And everybody said that the street number would go away. It didn't. And I wonder whether that analogy is going to hold true with regard to drugs as well.
Heather, what's your view?
Well, and I would just add this because your case is compelling and it's very articulate, and I love listening to it. As someone who's thought about this a lot, you wonder, one, whether it's true, whether that would actually occur, and two, whether you're trading a criminal justice problem for a public health problem, which you are to some extent.
Very much.
Yeah.
Heather.
Yeah, if we're going to legalize drugs, I think let's not do it on a race ground. I think there may be reasons to do so. I'm largely agnostic about it. I would just disagree that to treat this as some overwhelming magnet for illegal behavior. I recommend a book by Alice Goffman called On the Run. This was a University of Pennsylvania aspiring academic in sociology who lived 6 years in the Philadelphia, sort of the inner city, and befriended a group of young crack dealers, got extremely involved in their lives, and wrote a book about their existence. I disagree with the point of view. She ends up blaming the law and criminal justice system for their own decisions to break the law. But what she points out, to her credit, is a group of clean people who simply choose not to sell drugs or commit robberies. So there are probably the majority of people in the inner city who are not involved in the drug trade. They are making choices to abide by the law. They stay clear of the dirty people. And Robert Woodson has long said we should be studying the success cases and not be always obsessing about the failures. And that's a very valid point. I would also argue, I spoke earlier about this data-driven revolution that just transformed policing and brought about the longest and steepest crime drop into history, both in New York and nationally. That is known as the Comstat revolution. Prosecution is now trying to use the same techniques of data-driven analysis to decide how to prosecute cases. I looked at some of the massive conspiracy gang cases that the Manhattan DA brought in East Harlem. And through riding social media and using their prosecutorial resources to target the worst criminals, they got these massive gangs off the streets. None of these gangs who were shooting each other had anything to do with drug dealing. It is not the case, especially today when you have crews, that the only grounds for violence on the streets is a spin-off of drugs. In fact, the drug trade has gotten more peaceful of late because thanks to New York policing, which has driven it indoors. But the violence continues, and John by no means discounted the importance of rebuilding the family, but I would still opt for that. As conservatives have their root causes, liberals have their root causes. You know, the liberals are getting rid of poverty and income inequality, and the conservative root cause is the breakdown of the family. I wouldn't give up on that so quickly. I think that we have never tried a full-scale rhetorical crusade to revalorize the importance of fathers. That is something that really is taboo today to speak about that. But that's what we've got to do.
I want to ask the governor to respond to that and also to talk about it in terms of the issues of federalism and local control. Policing has traditionally been something that local communities engage in. We now have situations where attorney generals of the United States are asked to parachute into local law enforcement issues, despite the differences in the police force in terms of race and demographics between Ferguson and Baltimore and New York. The question I've got is policing local? Is it national? We've talked about the war on drugs. We've talked about Comstat, which was New York City driven. Where are we in terms of policing? Is it local? Is it national? Is it international?
It's all three, but with regard to public interaction with the state police force, it's 95% local, as we know. So, which is why you do what you do, right? And so, again, I'd feel a whole lot better about the national debate if it was about that issue, which is really the crux of the issue in Baltimore right now. What happened in this case? What process and procedures were followed or not followed? How did this guy end up with a severed spine? You articulately depress me with your initial comments because I'm sitting here. I don't agree with you, but you've made such a compelling case that I'm sitting here, geez, I'm depressed. But I do believe that there has never been a concerted effort And I understand there's going to be the left and the progressives are going to do their ism thing and ick thing, and everybody's going to be degraded and demonized, and that's what they do and all that. But we got to learn not to care, particularly politicians. I've been called everything. I'm a Republican in Maryland. Hostility does not intimidate me. And at some point, just the common sense notion that fathers in those homes telling the 15-year-old about the right, and the mother now has become, that particular mother has become the national symbol. But I wonder how many fathers in those homes, if they were there, could have had a, hey, you ain't going out there, you're doing your homework. You're going to practice. No. And we haven't had that. In fact, it's just been one long, steep decline since the 60s. And so I'm willing to try it, but it has to be everybody all in, and it has to be nobody really cares what the left says about you, because once you do, you're going to be intimidated, and you're going to be scared to lose a race, and you're going to be scared to be called a racist, and you're going to be scared. And if you're scared, you can't play in this league.
Well, I'm from Brooklyn.
I know, you're not scared.
We're not scared. I mean, Goodfellas, Wolf of Wall Street. I got 4 ISIS guys I've got to try. You know, I got mobsters, Gambino soldiers. I mean, as Judge McCasey will tell you, it's just, you know, another day at the beach, right?
Governor Ehrlich, you missed my point, though, with all due respect. It's not a matter of being scared. I mean, sure, people say mean things about you in the comments section, et cetera. It's just that in the black community, what would result is a debate with
Oh, no, you're right.
people talking about it. And I don't mean that the debate would be unpleasant because of its atmosphere. The result of the debate would be people saying, oh, this person said some deep things, that person said some deep things, but really it would come to a draw. There couldn't be any consensus among all of the people. And so there wouldn't be any change in black communities because no unified message could possibly come out.
Well, you say that, but the president a few months ago said exactly what we're talking about with regard to dads.
And gets roasted every time he does it by Michael Eric Dyson and the rest, saying that he's talking down to the black community.
And that's my point. We need a president who will say, okay, you have your opinion, but I have 5 decades of evidence and common sense that you're wrong, and I'm going to continue to say it repeatedly. I understand your point, and those folks are not going away, but I just think that it's worth a try, and not mutually exclusive of any other strategy, but it's worth a try because not just politicians, but pastors, community leaders, if more people sing really from the same page, I think we have a shot not to cure it, but maybe to turn around a little bit.
Heather, you think it's a guy thing or what?
Well, no, I mean, I think both sides are responsible that decide not to have a child in the context of a marriage. We often blame the fathers for their lack of personal responsibility, which is valid, but also I think mothers need to understand that the most important advantage that they can give their child is their father. And if they're not prepared to marry the father of their child, the fact of the matter is you shouldn't be having a child. And that's a hard thing to say because I think we have a sense of entitlement that everybody has a right to a child today. But I mean, that may be in the abstract true, but it is a recipe for hardship. And we don't want to encroach on later panels because the data and facts behind the difficulty of single parenting will be much more exhaustively analyzed, I'm sure. But I would just agree, I guess, with Governor Ehrlich that I think we just haven't tried it. And one of the reasons we haven't tried it is the dominance of feminism and the conceit that strong women can do it all. And men are basically being disappeared in our culture. So if we could get unanimity about the fact that no, children need their mothers and their fathers, I think it's premature to say that would have no effect, at least on the margins, on the way people think about child rearing. And marriage would not, would not be viewed as an optional add-on or a frill, which is kind of the way they're viewed now.
The notion of father as accessory. I've got 3 kids. It's a little scary. All right, I promised you we would have an opportunity for questions. I'm going to pretend that I'm back in my courtroom, and I'm going to say, is there a question somewhere in that speech? And it's not going to be pretty, because I can be the avuncular telephone salesman or Lord Vader. It's up to you. Ma'am, we'll start with you and then you.
It's true.
And keep your voice up. Still keep your voice up.
Cheryl Washington with the National Center for State Courts. I'm struck by the nexus between what's described as the left's position regarding poverty and income inequality and what the speakers have characterized as the right's position for concern about the breakdown of the family, and the fact that those two are so interrelated. So many of the women I know who have had husbands and children with husbands, often marriages break down because of the fact that they are making more money, what have you. You know, the men sometimes can't find jobs. In other families, there's so many men who are going to prison for low-level drug-related crimes.
And so your question is?
My question is, do you see where those two are so related? And the fact that, you know, there's a lot of discussion about the suite or the street. And you see in a lot of communities where a lot of drug use goes on in the college dorm suite versus in poor communities in the street.
Okay, we have
and
the
can you
question.
talk about the nexus between
We
not
have
being
the-
able to get a
We
job?
have the question. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, very few people are going to prison for drug use. That's a fallacy. And prison remains a lifetime achievement award for persistence in criminal offending. This thug, and I'm going to use the word thug without apology, who shot a police officer lethally in New York City over the weekend, he had an unbelievable rap sheet. He's out on the streets. You know, if you can't keep that guy in, the pressures are still to keep people out. And I just don't accept the excuse that young men have to sell drugs in order to have a livelihood, because every day there are people in poor communities who are going to jobs and doing the right thing. People, and I know the argument to say, well, how can you expect marriage when we have this mass incarceration complex? Well, they're making babies before they're in prison. You know, so they weren't in prison when they conceived that child. So prison is not what's responsible for them not being fathers. It's their own decision to procreate and not be responsible for their children.
One of the most pernicious myths about Black America is the idea that the reason for Black men taking to the streets is that there are no jobs available to them. Heather is absolutely right about that. The data is absolutely crushing. Read On the Run by Alice Goffman. Read Gang Leader for a Day by Columbia sociologist Sudhir Venkatesh. Read William Julius Wilson's work. In between the lines of all of those texts, which are cherished by liberals and the left, it's quite clear that the problem in inner city communities is not that there's no way for a Black man to work. And this is hard to say, especially with a voice like mine. It sounds like I'm being moralistic, and I'm really not. But it's not that there aren't jobs available. There aren't wonderful jobs, but it's not there aren't jobs available. It's that we live in a time when it's possible not to take one of those jobs. And the question is, well, how are you going to make money? And I come back to my point. And as far as statistics from 2001 to 2013, over half of Black men who are in federal penitentiaries are there for drug possession or sale. Another 16% in federal are there saying that they did something violent or they stole something to get drugs. The figures are lower for state penitentiaries. But nevertheless, the drug issue is very important, and I think it's clear that once drug sale took over black communities, the level of violence in black communities shot up alarmingly and became part of the reason that we're here. If you read about a black community in the 60s and 70s, one of the oddest things from our vantage point 40 and 50 years later is that there was so much less violence. People complained about what there was, and then you find out it was about switchblades and things. Everything changes with the whole drug culture and context. And so, it's those two things. One, it's not that there are no jobs, and two, I really do maintain that drug penalties are the main problem, and without them, we would see a major sea change that wouldn't require trying to change people's minds through preaching, which it seems to me doesn't work.
Governor, and then the next question.
Sometimes these notions get their own lives and the evidence is not there to back it up. But with regard to the last point, not only is there evidence, but I was part of that. Because if you were in state legislatures in the 1980s, which I was, or in judiciary committees, which I was, and I remember to this day the debates about increasing predicate offenses to get more kids waived into adult court that used to be juvenile offenses because we're going to get tough on crime. We're going to have a war on drugs. And as we know, some of those kids were savable. And some of those kids we lost because we put them in adult prison. It's just a fact. It's just a fact. And so we learn, hopefully, but we still feel some consequences, some repercussions from that mindset. And I remember to this day those debates. And I'm sure the debate we had in the Maryland General Assembly was replicated in legislatures across the country.
Ma'am, your question. You. Yes.
Hi, Lee Bose with America Works. The women don't want these men involved in their children's lives. You know, for years we were counseling the men who were not paying child support about involvement with their children. They repeatedly said they wanted to be involved, but that their mothers of the children were keeping them back. And I think that's something nobody addresses. They feel that these are not reputable people, the men that they've fathered the children with. They don't want their children exposed to these men. So I think it's naive to think that it's just on the man's part. It really isn't.
All right, I didn't hear a question, so I'll hear one from you, sir.
My name is Rich Foster, the retired director of the museum. I'd like to make a couple of quick points because I know you want to keep it moving.
I will keep it moving.
Okay, I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will.
My desire is going to be satisfied.
I'm sure you will. Number one, I don't think you can police your way out of this problem anymore with further incarceration. Number two, I have some issues with legalization, maybe regulation or a red light district or something like that where it's controlled and not necessarily
Hamsterdam, that
legalized.
was called in the wire.
Yes,
Hamsterdam.
that's it, you know. And thirdly, I would take issue with the governor in that, yes, legalizing numbers may have not eliminated it, but it has reduced it. You, Judge, will probably know that there are no more Bumpy Johnsons running around because the employment opportunities in the numbers trade have been reduced by legalization and the lottery. So the question I would ask is there something in between what I'm hearing in the polarized of more policing, more incarceration, or legalization?
We'll start with the governor.
You can have both. You can have broken windows, and you can have a real debate about drug liberalization. They're not mutually exclusive.
Heather?
Yeah, you know, I'm well aware of the dilemma of somebody who's still on the fence about legalization because I can come back to John and say, by not enforcing drug laws, again, you are ignoring those voices in the community who say, I am threatened by the dealers, and I also don't want kids smoking dope in public because that's also an assault on public order. But I know the very persuasive response of John, which is that, but the only reason that this is a threat is because it's illegal, and it carries with it the aura of violence precisely because it has been driven underground. And so remove that, it will, the threat will go away. I'd want to just add some statistics. John is right about the drug proportions in federal prisons being about half. But federal prisons are only 12% of the national prison population. The vast majority of prisoners are in state prisons, 88%. And there, the increase in incarceration for the last 2 decades or so has been overwhelmingly from violent and property crime. The drugs offenders are about 20% of the state prison population. And the other fact is, as Governor Ehrlich experienced, the push to increase drug penalties came predominantly from the Congressional Black Caucus, at least with regards to crack, because of the public health problem that Governor Ehrlich mentioned. Rangel, Major Owens, they said, this is the worst servitude since slavery, what crack is doing to our community. So this becomes simply an empirical or medical problem of, do you get more or less drug use by criminalizing or decriminalizing? But we should be clear that more addiction is not a good thing for our society. So then it becomes really, again, an empirical question of how do you get less people using drugs.
John?
Heather, we're close on this, and so close that I want to respond. State prison figures, as far as I know, are 35% are in either for drug offenses or having done something where they say that they did it because they wanted to buy some drugs. Then as far as property crimes go, the question becomes, why do we have reason to believe that the property crimes were committed? In a number of those cases, it is highly likely that the person did not have a job. And then you ask, well, why did this person not have a job, and why is that joblessness so epidemic in these communities? And the answer from one segment is, well, there are no jobs available, but you and I both know that that's not what it is. And so what creates a culture where it's a norm to not go get a job after 12th grade? And once again, I think that that norm is largely driven by the fact that in those communities there is this optional black market, which leads me to think that if you took that away, you would have an effect probably disproportionate to the exact figures that we're talking about, although I know I'm getting into muddier water in this case. Otherwise, I just agree with what was said by.
But I don't agree that somebody's going to go work for McDonald's who's not inclined to do so. I think that is a problem of values and the willingness to work in a job that requires promptness, showing up every day, not bitching at your boss when he exercises authority. And this again gets back to the family, because these boys are not used to, they have not understood self-control and authority from having a father
Those
at home.
teenagers
General
are making fun.
Mukasey, hang on. General Mukasey, and then continue. You may be seated, sir, if you wish.
Thanks. Michael Mukasey, a statement and then a question. Nobody is in federal prison for possession of drugs, simple possession. I've never seen a case like that, and I've got about 25 years experience in the federal system. Possession with intent to sell, yes, based on volume or purity or both. I mean, if somebody's got a carload of drugs, then they're not there, they don't have that carload for personal use. Question for John McWhorter. Let's assume that we legalize. What happens to the users? And do you think that they're going to get jobs? If not, who is going to provide the subsidy for them to live out their lives in a bright blue haze?
Mm-hmm. This is important. There is evidence that if we had the kind of legalization I'm talking about, there would be an uptick in addiction. I have talked with Mark Kleiman about this repeatedly, actually, and it's hard to imagine that that would not happen. And you know what? The race situation in this country is at such an intractable standstill. We're just going around and around in circles, no offense intended, but we're having the same symposia. It goes on and on and on. I honestly think that that uptick in addiction, with all of its ills, could be classifiable as collateral damage if it had the effect that I'm talking about. I'm about to do an essay. I think there are 3 things that America needs to do where we have to allow certain kinds of collateral damage. I also think, because incentive works, that if that were really the case and it were visible, then there would be more research done on getting people off of drugs in effective ways, because we don't have any magic bullets at this point, and it's partly because not enough research goes into it. But openly, certainly, addiction would go up, but if we could stop this debate that we're having, this sense in the black community that there is no hope, the general idea that institutional racism keeps a group from performing, which I think is not true, solving all of this might require that uptick in addiction. I openly say that we should tolerate it.
One more question here.
Bob Woodson, Center for Neighborhood Enterprise.
You may remain seated as well, sir.
Okay, thank you, Judge.
By the way,
I do what judges tell me.
Well, thank you. I like that. By the way, as a child of the 60s, I hate to correct my senior colleague, but the phrase is purple haze. But go ahead. My generation, what can you do? Go ahead, sir.
What we've heard thus far, just a combination of incentives and sanctions. We haven't talked about what is the role of institutions within those communities. We saw in the streets of Baltimore, Good Samaritans pouring into the streets, cooking food for the police officers. We saw men with 300 on there intervening in the young people. So there are elements within those communities, mediating institutions there, that have the respect and control of young people. And there are examples that I can give where gang violence has been dramatically reduced by empowering those healing agents that are within communities, but we don't seem to discuss those intermediary institutions. We just talk about it as if people are only influenced by incentives and sanctions. There are cultural value elements there. Why don't we ever talk about those?
Well, yeah, that's a really good point. I'll name 2, pastors and coaches. Exactly. And maybe not in that order, by the way, because the latter controls playing time and team and things that are important. And that is not a race, that is a youth observation, and race has nothing to do with that. So, and you saw the pastors coming together the other night, and in some of these communities, they are more powerful than any politician, that's for sure.
I would take coaches over pastors.
I think you're probably right.
One more comment, sir. You, sir.
Question about policing. When I was a student in Los Angeles, I remember asking a cop if he knew about the Rodney King beatings, and if he had been trained about it. He had no idea what I was talking about. He hadn't heard of Rodney King. And then I heard an interview with an older resident of Baltimore who said he missed the time when the beat cop was walking the neighborhood and knew the families, knew who your mom was. If you messed up, he'd go talk with her. What is your sense of police engagement with the communities, their presence in the communities, and their acceptance there, and knowing the people in those communities? Thank you.
Well, we have the expert here.
But actually, you know, this is a question that I hear all the time, especially in inner city residents. We used to know our beat cop, and I actually haven't answered where that beat cop went, because the initial replacement for the walking the beat was the radio car, and the idea that we were going to measure police efficiency by how quickly they got to 911 calls. That philosophy has been largely discredited. And now we measure outcomes. The police measure their success by how much crime has dropped rather than by how many arrests are made or how quickly they got to a call. So I'm not sure. There are people, in New York at least, officers walking the streets. And they, of course, were criticized for engaging in too many proactive stops, the whole issue of stop, question, and frisk. obviously, the more that you can know the community, the better. I actually still don't know if that is truly not the case anymore, and if it's not the case, why it's not happening. But obviously that is a important fact. I was in Louisiana recently, and the woman who drove me to the New Orleans airport actually said she loves the cops, and she amazingly particularly loves white cops. So those I can really speak to. But the reason she loved the cops is they came to her school when she was growing up and said, "We're your friends, and please come to us when you need help." And my view is, boy, if it's that easy, let's do it. I'm not. It probably is not, but the more interactions we can have, I'm a big supporter of the Explorers program as well, to get kids into precincts and figure out, how policing works and see it from the other side.
One of the things I would like to explore is how I could stop the clock here and give us the time that we need to fully explore this with this extraordinary panel who've been gracious, and you who have been incredibly patient and kind and knowledgeable. I thank you for that, and I turn to our Uber moderator for comments.